God of Highschool is the second webtoon anime that Crunchyroll have produced thus far, with the first being Tower of God, and is the polar opposite of the first one. In Tower of God, people loved the story but felt that the animation lacked something, whereas in God of Highschool, people loved the amazing animation and fight scenes but felt that the story is a patchwork abomination, filled with loose threads and pointless story gaps. Now, that being said, I personally think the plot of the first 5 episodes goes together okay. It is not the best, as some of the characters seem to be made out to be narratively important with their build-up and foreshadowing, only to be immediately thrown in the trash pile made to be salvaged at a far later point down the line. And I personally felt the whole friend dying aspect felt a bit forced. But, on its own, episodes 1 to 5 does the story of a tournament arc okay. It does the actual tournament arc itself well, but it lacks the needed prior knowledge of the characters to make it great, as it is akin to watching a tournament arc in Black Clover or My Hero Academia without any of the prior knowledge of the characters. The fights themselves are good, but they just lack the meaning behind them that knowing the characters gives them beforehand. But, complaints aside, the story still flows well. That is personally where my praise of the story ends, because from episode 5 onwards, the story seems to be going in a downward spiral. One of the more important plot characters, young Jacques, whose name I've just butchered, is only featured in 4 scenes. A scene where he's introduced, another where he gets beaten up, another scene in a hospital bed, and finally a scene where he becomes an Akira-type monster. This lack of screen time means that when he dies, we just don't care. You can add a crying maid and remove all the background music, but it does not make it sad, because we have zero connections with the character. Also, why does he turn into a monster? His power was apparently lightning based according to the tournament, not absorption. So how does he suddenly have this power if they had previously shown another? Like, if he had absorption all along, then why didn't he bother using it in the fight? It felt they had gutted a load of his scenes that would help explain this to me, to meet the time constraints that the anime suffered under. And he is not the only character that this happened to. They had also previously introduced 2 assassin characters who immediately failed to defeat the commissioners before disappearing, and we never see them again. Which leads to the question of why bother including them in the first place in this arc. I mean, we later see Nox fighting on the street against the commissioners. Why aren't they there? There are other scenes whose inclusions also make no sense, like when Judge Q flips out at Park, only to be told that the reason why he's angry is that announced his family were killed was not true, and the family are in fact alive. We didn't see them die to begin with, so why bother including this scene at all? They had already made it out that the judge had no pay for 6 months, why bother increasing it to 9? The whole point of this scene is to try and establish a link between him and Dawei, yet the whole scene with Dawei could work just as well without it. So why waste time on a fake out that accomplishes nothing, which they could spend explaining or straightening out confusing elements of the plot? Like, what are the powers of the 6? How can Nox summon their god and sword into reality when other people can only summon smaller fighters? And if they could do that, why hadn't they done it in years prior? And that is not including the massive arsepool moment of episode 11. Taking a step back, the primary reason why a lot of people don't like Darling and the Franxx, massive spoiler warning here, is because it seemingly pulled the whole humanity is controlled by aliens out of nowhere, with no real setup to make you think that aliens were involved. A literal jump the shark moment. In God of Highschool, that moment comes where a magician character turns loads of nukes into an even bigger nuke, then throws that and a meteorite at a god that the evil cult Nox summoned along with angels after teleporting the entire city away from the fight. Prior to this, you can argue that all the magical elements were limited to where the major characters were and the events involving them, with no one who's not already aware of chakra being really affected by it, apart from maybe some minor civilians which we didn't really care about. And all the powers that prior to this had bases in either fighting or summoning deities or monsters to assist them. After this, you wonder if the guy who could control nukes and summon asteroids, why he had not used that before against Nox, especially when his grandson got massively beaten up. Why did he just stand around doing fuck all until the last possible moment? Also, what the hell was the Nox bad guy doing throughout the entire final fight? He literally just stands there in a fighting pose before being hauled off by his accomplices. It's as if they're telling 2 different stories. The first about Jin Mori and a tournament called the God of Highschool, and a second around the evil cult Nox and an attempt to take over the world, with each story fighting for screen time before they inevitably intersect, leading viewers to become confused about the Nox storyline since it had far less screen time than the actual fights in the tournament arc. The cause of this problem ultimately is that webtoons are organised into seasons. Tower of God adapted the first season of its manga and they cut out a decent chunk of the content. And that was only 70-ish chapters, and people were still unhappy that there were scenes cut. In God of Highschool, they're adapting 112 chapters into 13 episodes, which means that a lot of unique side stories and interesting details would have had to have been cut to save time. I have personally not read the webtoon, but there's no way that his story is as chaotically organised as the one portrayed by the anime is. The reason why the story is a mess is due to how the anime has crammed a large in-depth story into a single core, to create as narrow a plot as possible to focus mainly on the fights, which are expertly animated, but as a result has left the story nothing more than a broken husk of what it could truly be. And that personally for me is a real shame.